So welcome at NDUB lecture series at the 5th episode. And today we have a very special speaker from India, who is Nandini Sen. Who teaches English at Delhi University, and also she has a lot of awards, and she's the fellow at the prestigious Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla. Also the proud recipient of Charles Wallace Fellowship for Academic Research in London, and the ambassador for Peace Prize for her work towards educating, as just our Golam Sarwar Sir has mentioned, slum dwellers, and the Right India Award for her creative writings. She writes on, as Sarah has already said, on the marginalized people, diaspora studies, African studies, and comparative literature. So we will get to know about the speaker, but also let me introduce today's panelists. This lecture series will be chaired by Professor Golam Sarwar Chowdhury, the head of the Department of English at Notre Dame University Bangladesh. And also we are really glad and grateful to have our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Father Patrick Daniel Gaffney, CAC. Welcome, Father. I would request you to share a few words before we begin.
Oh, thank you, Shams and Professor Chowdhury and Professor Sen. I'm privileged to be here, and I feel I'm really underqualified to say anything given what we expect from you. That's to give you a little encouragement. But I was just going to say, you know, the topic of your talk tonight has to do with plague and pandemic. And it's very closely tied to exile, you know, being, you might say, cut off from ordinary activity. We usually think of exile in terms of space, that I cannot move or move about in territory I'm familiar with or would like to go. We think of as a kind of imprisonment, but it's also a kind of, you know, barrier to contact with people we love, people we know. Today we have Zoom platforms and telephones and other things, but it's not the same at all. In fact, our expectations seem to have gone up the more electronic and cyber possibilities we have, and we miss each other more. And of course, what they usually say is, there's an expression in German, you know, Hautkontakt, touching the skin, you know, to see all those, you know, nonverbal cues that people cast off when you're in person, and to interact where every wink of the eye and change of tone of voice is another signal. And to substitute that sort of by, you know, electronic means is really a false illusion. We all know that. So we want to think about these things. We want to hear about other people's experience, especially people who have reflected on it as you have and taught these things to people who haven't had as much academic training. You learn things from them too, because academics is also a form of exile. It's a form of prison. It's a form of limitations. So we always learn by opening our eyes, opening our ears to those who've seen other things and been other places. So I'd like to welcome you and tell you we're very much privileged to have you with us, and looking forward to your words.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Father Patrick Daniel Gaffney, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, for being with us and sharing such wonderful insights, as well as welcoming our today's special guest. I would also request our head of the department, Professor Golam Sarwar Chowdhury, to introduce the guest and this lecture series to our audience who will be watching us for the first time today.
Well, I've already introduced Dr. Sen, but I'd like to add a few words about the background of this lecture series. We actually started this lecture series in order to introduce Notre Dame University Bangladesh, not only to Bangladeshis, but also people throughout the world. Because as you know, there is a University of Notre Dame which is in the United States of America. In fact, Father Patrick Gaffney, who's our present Vice Chancellor, was a professor at Notre Dame University in Indiana before he came over, and he was appointed Vice Chancellor at NDUB, that is Notre Dame University Bangladesh. Notre Dame University Bangladesh is not a local campus of the university at Indiana. However, we have very strong relationship between the two institutions in terms of exchange of students, exchange of scholars, and we look forward to having closer ties with Notre Dame University in Indiana, so that the NDUB, that is Notre Dame University Bangladesh, is a relatively new university, about 5 years. We are still at its formative stage. So hopefully with more support coming from Indiana, we look forward to establishing NDUB not only as one of the most renowned universities in Bangladesh, but also our aim is that over the years, NDUB will be becoming a beacon, a lighthouse of higher studies in this region. Just like as Dr. Sen may be a student of one of these so many missionary schools throughout South Asia, I'm privileged to be one. I'm a student of St. Placid School in Chittagong, which was established way back in 1858. And as you know, the missionaries, the Brothers of the Holy Cross and the Fathers of the Holy Cross have established wonderful institutions throughout South Asia, throughout this region, throughout the subcontinent. And we have a neighboring college in our sense, in the South Asian sense, called Notre Dame College, which is 70 years old. And it's one of the most formidable colleges in Bangladesh that has produced leaders in every strata of our society. So this is our intention. And keeping this intention in mind, the intention of being willing to offer higher studies to students of every class, every strata of the society, high-class education. Over the years, the university has started its journey. And I can assure you that with people like Father Gaffney around, maybe it will take a few years, but I can definitely tell you that NDUB will be one day a very renowned university. So this is what the background of my university, and the largest department of this university is the English department. Largest in terms of students, the number of students, and also my young faculty, my young colleagues like Ahmed Tahsin Shams, who does such a wonderful job in coordinating and presenting these lectures. We hold lectures on the first Saturday of every month and the last Saturday of every month. And I guess this is the 6th or 7th lecture that we plan to continue. Sixth. We plan to continue it over the year, over 2021. And I'm sure Dr. will be in touch with Dr. Shen, and we can invite scholars from India as well to be our guests. So with this introduction, with these few words, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Shen and listen to the lecture today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And namaskar to all of you. It's my privilege. I mean, this country I have not visited, but half my family comes from there. I think half my wardrobe in terms of the saris, which I've inherited from my grandmom and my mother and my machis have all come from there. And so I'm so happy that at least I'm able to be part of this incredible country, even though it's through the virtual mode. I can't thank you all enough. Primarily, let me start with Father Gaffney. It isn't every day that I get to interact with the Vice Chancellor. It's a huge privilege. And when I hear from Professor Chowdhury, I know what I'm sure Professor envisages for his institution is going to be realized very shortly. It's going to be the #1 institution in Bangladesh very shortly. And, the global renown I'm sure is there. It's sort of, with these lectures that you're organizing, I'm sure you're calling people from across the world. So that connect is already building. So my best wishes for this incredible university, and I'm sure it's going to gain great heights with people such as you at the helm of affairs, all three of you. Professor Chowdhury, thank you so much. It's thanks to you that I'm here today. And you've just been so generous and so kind in your invitation and calling me here today. I just hope my little expertise that I have is worth your time and the time that you spend with me. But I'm really privileged to be amongst you all. Our young friend Ahmed, thank you so much for being in touch and coordinating this. And everyone who's watching, I cannot see you, but my very best wishes to you, and I will be very happy to take questions from all my young friends who are watching us today. So if you now allow me, I will start the slideshow, and I'll take
Sure, ma'am.
Thank you. So, oh dear. Okay, is the
we can see
slide?
Yes.
Okay. So I called this presentation "Literature and Pandemics: Literature and Pandemic Lessons for the Humankind." The reason why I felt that the pandemic is teaching us huge lessons. I mean, we have been following. We've been reading, we've been following the news, and we are being constantly told manners the world around us speaking to us. It is telling us that there are areas which we have messed up badly in, and there are reasons why we are going through what we are going through. And as always, literature reflects life, or life is literature. And one is amazed to see how we have so many literary texts which are constantly telling us and cautioning us about what the world experiences in the situation of an epidemic or a pandemic. It has happened before, it will happen again. Everything is there for us to see. It's just that we've chosen not to see. So I start. Am I audible and the slides visible? Because I can't see anyone or...
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
You are clearly audible and the slides are visible.
Thank you so much. So I begin with a quote by an author you know very well, Albert Camus. And Camus talks about, and I begin with his words. So this whole concept that we talk about, death by plague or plagued to death, somehow pretty much one and the same. And what is Camus telling us? He says nobody is capable of really thinking about anyone, even in the worst calamity. We cannot stir a finger in this world without the risk of bringing death to somebody. Yes, I've been ashamed ever since I have realized that we all have plague, and I have lost my peace. And Camus says this in his very famous novel called The Plague, which he wrote in 1947. Somehow these words resonated with me. They resonated with me because I was immediately sensitized to how we are dealing with the current pandemic situation. Each one of us seems to only be worried about our own families, about ourselves, about the few people that we care for. The larger concerns, the bigger concern for the larger humanity is somehow lost in our obsession with ourselves. And in our obsession to protect ourselves, we have willy-nilly cut ourselves away from people who probably were not harming us in any which way. See, one of the first things that was done here, and I'm sure was done elsewhere also, we decided that all our domestic helps were not going to be allowed into our gated complexes anymore. And knowing fully well that they were not the carriers of the disease. The disease was coming from elsewhere. But that othering happened and they were cast away. And not only were they cast away, if some of us were human enough to continue to pay them their salaries and keep them in their houses and say, okay, wait out the plague, maybe we meet after that. Many of us did not do it, and there were countless people who went out of jobs. And I'm not even getting into the global recession and all of that. Anyways, you're reading about it. So what Camus is talking about and what we experience firsthand. Now, here is a situation where probably the first time, at least in my living memory, where one is faced with one's own mortality. Otherwise, death was an abstract construct. It was happening to someone else somewhere. Now, here is the first time that we felt that it could happen to us. It could happen to our family members. We are already hearing about people, dying within the family. It's coming close. It's come very, very close. So suddenly we are aware of our mortality, and yet the selfishness grows by the day. We only seem to be concerned about just our own. The rest of the world, whatever might happen, as long as we and ours are safe. And I think that's precisely what Camus is talking about and warning us about. So where does this term pandemic come from? Pardon me if I'm stating the obvious, but I thought, I have young audience and who might be interested in knowing. So pandemic, we all know pan is all and demos people. So it's an epidemic of an infectious disease that has spread across a large region, multiple countries, and it affects a substantial number of people. So remember all that hoo-ha happening about when is WHO going to declare the coronavirus as a pandemic. And then we have that throughout the human history, there have been several cases of the pandemics. And the ones that we are familiar with are smallpox and tuberculosis. And the most fatal pandemic in recorded history was the Black Death, which was also the plague. And it killed huge numbers, 75 to 200 million people in the 14th century. And other notable pandemics include the 1918 pandemic, the Spanish influenza, which wasn't too far away. So you would have heard, your great-grandfather or somebody mentioning it at some point of time. And of course, the current pandemics, which include the COVID-19 and HIV/AIDS. So HIV/AIDS is now in the state of, it's been contained, so it is now an epidemic. COVID-19 has not been contained yet, so it plagues on as a pandemic. Now, one of the writers in Delhi University, we study Sophocles. It's studied in the very first year by our undergraduate students. So I thought, I'm not sure what the syllabus in Bangladesh looks like, but I thought let me begin at the very beginning, and let me begin with Sophocles and his very, very popular tragedy, which has lived on way beyond his years and still continues to be one of the major sort of ways a tragedy is written as per Aristotle's definition of tragedies. So this tragedy, presumably all of you are familiar with, Oedipus Rex or Oedipus the King, and it was written as early as 430 to between 430 to 420 BC. And it begins, if you remember how Oedipus the King begins, it begins with the plague. It's because of the plague, it's because cattle is dying and people are dying, that if you remember, the people of Thebes have come to Oedipus and they are telling him to go and do something to stem this, to find out what it is that is causing this. So in the very first scene of the play, Sophocles presents the basic social and historical axis around which he will unfold his plot. And this devastating plague that dominates Thebes is presented to the audience through the dialogue. It opens with the dialogue between Oedipus and the priest. And these are the lines 1 to 67. And the king has already taken some action. If you remember, he sent his brother-in-law Creon to the oracle at Delphi to ask for a salvation plan. He's sent him to Apollo, to the seat of Apollo, to find out how to tackle this plague. and god Apollo, and then the people of Thebes get to know that the way they are going to be able to counter or be saved from this plague is to get rid of the person who has caused it. And the word here is miasma. It's a word again of Greek origin with a sense of moral, noxious pollution. So very interestingly, the plague, pestilence, in this case the pandemic, the epidemics, are linked to the moral, noxious pollution. So somewhere along the line, it is we who bring about the plague, in whichever sense of the term we wish to understand it. And at this point of time, if you remember, Oedipus tells his clansmen to not worry and to give him the time to find out who is it that has polluted the land. He tells his people, I'm going to find that person and I'm going to punish that person, little realizing that it is he who has unfortunately committed this quote-unquote crime, and you all know the story. So I quote from the text, "What means this reek of incense everywhere, and everywhere laments and litanies?" And the priest says, "A blight is on our harvest in the year, a blight upon the grazing flocks and herds, a blight on wives in travail, and withal, armed with his blazing torch, the god of plague, had swooped upon our city, emptying the house of Cadmus, and the murky realm of Pluto is full fed with groans and tears." So, what you hear and what you see, there are these incense sticks which are burning everywhere. There are laments and litanies. People are lamenting all over the city, and the priest tells us that the harvest is dying out. Children are dying even as they are being born, and God has somehow he's armed with his blazing torch. He has torched all of Thebes, and we are all burning. So the house of Cadmus is about to come to an end. So interestingly, this was not from an imaginative territory, as one normally would have thought that this is something that Sophocles imagines and writes, but the plague of Thebes is a historical epidemic. So he actually the plague had taken place, and we get to know it from the historical documentation done by Thucydides, and it is from here that we get to know that it actually happened, and that is the plague that Sophocles is talking about. The dates we've already done, 430 to 420 BC, and this lethal plague is described in this drama. And the medical researchers the contemporary medical researchers adopted a critical approach to Oedipus Rex in analyzing the literary description of the disease, unraveling its clinical features and defining a possible underlying cause. And the goals were to clarify whether the plague described in Oedipus Rex reflects an actual historical event, to compare it with the plague of Athens, which had been described by Thucydides, as it occurred around the same time when Sophocles was writing. And there is a very strong suggestion that this particular plague was caused by Brucella abortus. So the medical journals have recorded this, and this particular plague, which Sophocles is talking about, which we have all read in this phenomenal tragedies by Sophocles, they were actually historical realities which had taken place. Okay, so again, I quote a little from the text, and the reason why I do it is that you have a sense of when you read these lines, you can almost see it happening around us. So it's incredibly scary, if I may put it that way. So wasted thus by death on death, all our city perishes. Corpses spread infection around. The next one, the plague that is described in Oedipus Rex. Okay, so this I've already talked about. And another interesting thing that I registered was that in the play, the person who's the god who's blamed. So remember, the Greek gods are terribly human, and the god who's blamed here is Ares, the god of war. And appeals to citizens to propitiate the gods for freeing them from the plague and the pestilence. So I was, what interested me is this usage of, the war terminology. And currently, when we talk about people who are helping us fight COVID, so they're COVID warriors. So the whole sort of the ailment or the disease or the pandemic is a war that the humankind is fighting. So people who are fighting to save us are the warriors who are guarding us or who are trying to save us. So the terminology also comes very much. So this whole construct of the pandemic as war begins as early as Sophocles. So this gentleman you know by his picture, and he's the one who gave us these three incredible tragedies that set the tone for our understanding of Greek literature and the classical literatures, so to say, and of course the Shakespearean tragedies. So now I kind of skipped centuries, and I'm going to talk a little about Shakespeare and the plague. The reason why I talk about Shakespeare and the plague, there was this WhatsApp message that was going round, and we were being told that stop being lazy. Remember Shakespeare, who wrote King Lear during the plague, and how can you be so lazy? So I chose to study it a bit, and interestingly, Shakespeare lived and died in the times of the plague, so to say, but he somehow chose not to write about it very much. It's very interesting, but Shakespeare, probably because of how famous he was as a writer, and in a sense he was a populist writer, he chose not to sort of talk very much about the plague. It just finds very brief mentions in his work. So Shakespeare lived his entire life, as one would say, in the shadow of the bubonic plague. So in the parish register of the Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, the vicar had recorded that there was this baptism that had happened of one Johannes Shakespeare. So that was our man. And a few months later, in the same register, the vicar noted the death of Oliver Gunn, an apprentice weaver. And in the margins next to that entry, scribbled the words, "Here begins the plague." So we get to know that, the plague and Shakespeare's life, so to say, were almost synonymous. You have this constant, he sort of lived through the plague, as one would say it. And we know that it comes in waves. So, the plague was recurrent, and the playwright faced it on various occasions. But interestingly, he does not write very much about it. He does not talk very much about the epidemic. So at that point of time, the epidemic had taken the lives of around a fifth of the town's population. By good fortune, it spared the life of infant William Shakespeare and his family. So, and such outbreaks did not rage on forever. With the help of strict quarantines and a change in the weather, the epidemic would slowly wane, as it did in Stratford, and life would resume its normal course. But after an interval of a few years, in cities and towns throughout the realm, the plague would return. And it generally appeared on the scene with little or no warning. Now, this bit is extremely scary. So just when you feel that the pandemic is letting up or the plague is letting up, it just comes back. So you don't know how many times one is going to be having to encounter this, and how many sort of waves is one going to have to encounter. Obviously, in Shakespearean times, it would be contained, and then it would come right back. And this kept happening. And like I was just reading, that it hit the scene without any warning. So one didn't quite realize that they were going to be hit by the plague and it would be upon them suddenly. And the only ways of getting past a plague, a pandemic, is exactly what we are doing now: the strict quarantine and sort of sanitized situations and strict quarantines. And that's what would happen. But then again, it would relapse and again it would come back. And it was terrifyingly contagious. And victims would awaken with fever and chills. And there was a feeling of extreme weakness or exhaustion. And it would give way to diarrhea, vomiting, bleeding from the mouth, nose, or rectum, and swollen lymph nodes, and the telltale buboes, from where the bubonic plague, the term comes from, in the groin or the armpit. And the death was awful. A person would die in great agony, and the death would be, it was fatal, and the person who contracted it would more often than not die, and it was a horrifying death. So it was recognized that the rate of infection was much higher in densely populated cities than in the country. So again, one can see the similarities of the current situation, that the countryside, more or less, even in our country, that the villages are comparatively less affected than the metropolis, the cities. And more often than not, people ran away to these rural retreats. Though when they went to the rural retreats, they carried the disease with them. And pretty much what happened in our country, because initially it was the cities which were grappling with the disease. And then when the cities suddenly closed down, when we had this sudden lockdown, we had this terrifying situation where the migrant laborers were forced to walk down to their hometowns. Some of you might have seen the kind of news that was coming out of India at that point of time. Lakhs of people on the road. They were walking kilometers, the entire families. And people died during this walk. Women gave birth to children. There were exemplary tales of courage where a girl ferried her father in a bicycle and rode for kilometers. All kinds of stories, and each story was worse than the previous one. Countless people died as they made that terrifying journey from the cities to the villages. And when they reached the villages, it wasn't your regular homecoming that they faced. They were shunned by their own relatives because people were scared that they were disease carriers. So effectively, the migrant laborer who traveled from the city to the village, who was othered by the people in the cities whose houses they had constructed and whose cities they had entirely constructed, they were completely othered and banished, so to say. They walked those countless kilometers to reach their hometowns, where again they were sort of treated as pariahs, and nobody wanted them in. And so it was a sort of a double rejection, so to say, for many of them. And I'm not even getting here about the loss of jobs, about the loss of what little monetary subsistence these guys had. They lost it all, and of course they lost their jobs. So it was absolutely terrifying and devastating the way the whole thing played out. Coming back to Shakespeare, so when these deaths passed, so here they were careful. They went through it in a certain clinical manner in order to be able to contain the deaths. So when there were over 30 deaths, they banned assemblies, feasts, archery contests, and other forms of mass gathering. Now, all this would sound very, very familiar because in the current situation too, when the times were very bad, all the theaters closed down, whether they were film theaters, whether they were stage, and so on. Even today, we are going through different kinds of closures of different kinds, as and how the state decides they wish to take it forward. But all kinds of things are happening. So the assemblies were banned, the feasts were banned, the archery contests were banned. Overall, all kinds of mass gatherings were banned. And since it was believed that it was impossible to become infected during the act of worship, the church services were not included in the ban, though the infected were not permitted to attend. So again, very similar. So because there is always this sense of this sense that religion protects. So you keep the religious houses open and you shut everything else down. But the public theatres in London, which routinely brought together 2,000 or 3,000 people in enclosed spaces, were ordered shut. Now, these were the public theatres where Shakespearean plays would be performed, but these places were shut down, and it would remain shut for many months before the death rate came down sufficiently for the authorities to allow those theatres to reopen yet again. And Shakespeare lived through all of this, these multiple closures of the theatres, and then they would open. But very interestingly, he somehow did not want to write an entire play about the plague or any such thing. Okay, so in 1606, the deaths from the plague led to the closure of theatres. The disease reached the playwright's house in London, and it was to change his professional life and that of the whole of drama forever. And yet, very interestingly, the master playwright does not engage with the plague the way one would have thought. When your entire life is shadowed by the plague, one would think that you would talk a lot about this, but he chooses not to. So interestingly, none of his characters die of the plague. There is no mention in any of his plays about the shutting down of the theatres. And the only mention that we find is the description of the ghastly symptom of the king's insult to his daughter Goneril, and he says, what King Lear says, "Thou art a boil, a plague sore, an embossed carbuncle in my corrupted blood." Again, points to be noted here: the boil, the plague sore, corrupted blood. So all the time, the one thing that keeps sort of reiterating itself from the Sophoclean times to the Shakespearean times and to the contemporary times is that there is something in your blood. There is this connect between the human and the plague. There is the connect between. Sometimes it is linked to your morality. Sometimes it's linked to your physicality. But there seems to be this connect that one is constantly talking about. The one play that very definitely talks about the plague is a play all of you recognize, Ben Jonson's The Alchemist. Remember, The Alchemist begins with how the owners of the property, they have gone to the countryside in order to avoid the plague, while the servant makes merry with their property, and then that whole thing about how the servant chooses to call himself the master, and that whole thing plays out. So Ben Jonson, very definitely his contemporary, who talks about the plague and he mentions it. Now this is a poem. Again, the date is 1592. Similar timings. This is Thomas Nash, and it's actually called A Litany in Time of Plague. And it tells us something that we probably learnt the hard way. And let me read this out to you. Rich men trust not in wealth. Gold cannot buy you health. Gold cannot buy you health. Physic himself must fade. All things to end are made. The plague full swift goes by. I am sick. I must die. Lord, have mercy on us. Beauty is but a flower, which wrinkles will devour. Brightness falls from the air. Queens have died young and fair. Dust hath closed Helen's eye. I am sick. I must die. Lord, have mercy on us. So this the reason why I read this poem and why it sensitizes me to the current situation is this: the one thing, if the plague has taught us anything, the one thing that probably the coronavirus and the pandemic has taught us, that it does not care about your station in life. It does not care about your about what kind of money you might have. The ailment, the disease does not care for your political or your, it doesn't care whether you are a very rich person or a very poor person. It affects everyone similarly. So all of us who have felt very proud, whether of our, a certain station in our lives or a certain bank balance, not us professors, we never have enough, but others. But if one has gloated over these things and or thought about these things as something that makes you special, as compared to the people that you see outside, the workmen, the plumber, the sweeper, and so on. Well, the disease does teach you that they're not going to see what your station in life is, whether you're a rich person or whether you're a queen. The end is going to be, the disease is going to affect you similarly, and the end will be just as brutal. And we have been seeing it as, unfortunately, 2020 has seen so many people leave us, who we never thought would go so soon, but they have. And unfortunately, it does not spare anybody. Okay. So one of the most important journals of the plague year was written by who else but Daniel Defoe. Defoe, those of you who have read, I presume all of you who have read Robinson Crusoe, know that Defoe has this incredible sense of, like Robinson Crusoe, noting everything down. Everything has to be coded, noted with date, time. So even though Crusoe went missing for good 29 years, he managed to keep this incredible journal where he was actually talking about his everyday acquisitions of what he was doing. In a similar vein, Daniel Defoe wrote a journal of the plague year, and he does it with an express purpose to tell people that in case ever such a thing is to happen, in case the world is ever faced with something what they were facing at that point of time, he wanted people to be forewarned. He wanted people to know that this is what plague is going to look like and this is what you need to do. So it's incredible because we do not invest very much in history. We treat literature as fiction, and we refuse to learn our lessons. And when I say we, I speak for all of us, and I speak for all humanity. So every time then when such a thing happens, it takes us by surprise. We forget that the historical evidence is all there, the literary evidence is all there. But such is our amnesia that we choose to forget. So what does he say? So it is an account of one man's experience in the year 1655, in which the bubonic plague had struck the city of London in what became known as the Great Plague of London, and the last epidemic of the plague in that city. And the book is told chronologically, though without sections or chapter headings, and with frequent digressions and repetitions. So I quote a little from the text, and the reason why I quote this was because I found it again so close to my heart, because of the kind of media that we have nowadays. So nowadays we have what goes as the national media, we have the social media, and then there is so much information, and there is so much information, and there is so much disinformation, if one may use the term, and there is so much misinformation. So all of that is so fag end of the day. You might wake up one morning with a message telling you that if you have tulsi ka patta, you will be able to counter the corona. Next morning we are told something else, and a third and a fourth, and so on. What he says, I found to be very interesting. He says, we had no things as printed newspapers in those days to spread rumors and reports of things, and to improve them by the invention of men. I have lived to see practice since. So they didn't have the printed newspapers then, but we do, and we are having so much fun with all the media that we seem to have now. Defoe, as always, he is didactic in his manner of writing. He is that one man who's going to tell you what that true Englishman is supposed to be like, and by that, how everyone needs to behave. So he continues to write, and I quote, I have set this particular down so fully, the narrator states, because I know not, but it may be of moment to those who come after me, if they come to be brought to the same distress. A journal aims to lay out the blueprint that future societies can follow when confronted with such dire circumstances. So it's a faithful writing down of what the plague might do to you, and as always, Defoe is concerned that he needs to leave behind everything in written so that people coming after him or generations after, people would know what they are likely to face and how are they supposed to counter it. And I quote from the text, it must be confessed that though the plague was chiefly amongst the poor, yet were the poor the most venturous and fearless of it, and went about their employment with a sort of brutal courage. I must call it so, for it was founded neither on religion or prudence. Scarce did they use any caution, but run into any business which they could get employment in, though it was the most hazardous. Such was that of tending the sick, watching houses shut up, carrying infected persons to the pest house, and which was still worse, carrying the dead away to their graves. So as always, we see this incredible camaraderie and this incredible, when I was talking to you about the migrants, there was such stories also of camaraderie. Now here were these people whom the city-bred elite had cast away quite comfortably. These were poor people on the streets, but they didn't give up on each other. There was always the fear of the sickness, but their ability to be together and help each other was much higher than the fear of the sickness. Whereas the rich and the prosperous locked themselves up in their houses and refused to budge so as they could keep themselves safe. So Defoe mentions this, and I thought this was really so true of the kind of stories that one was hearing with what was happening around us. And then, of course, this I found too incredible not to read out. So wherever God erects a house of prayer, the devil always builds a chapel there, and it will be found amongst upon examination that the latter has the largest congregation. So Defoe is playing around with the fact that there are too many. There are some good people for sure, but there are too many evil people all around. People making money out of the plague. People conning others. And exactly the kind of things that you are experiencing today. So hospitals, private hospitals overcharging, spiraling costs of all things which should have been provided for free, but no. Even things like the corona vaccine being the talk of elections. So it's politicized to that extent, and the politics that is playing over the pandemic in the world. So some people denying that the pandemic exists, some people trying to do the sensible thing by it. And in all of this, science and caution goes to the wind, but what remains is this kind of insidious behavior that we seem to be seeing across the world. So for me, what seemed very, very interesting when I was doing this research was to see that this is so contemporary. We are experiencing it. And to think that all of this was written down so many years ago, which we had completely, when I'd read, Daniel Defoe earlier, I had wondrously dismissed this as an occurrence at certain point of time, and things that storytelling was made of, without realizing that this was reality, and this was happening all around you, and to think that all this literature was there with us, has always been there with us, and yet we were caught so much by surprise when it hit us. So now I talk about a contemporary, not contemporarily, but Foucault. You all know much later in terms of the time frame. This is something that Foucault talked about. He mentions Defoe, and he mentions the plague, and he talks about the three dreams of the plague. And this is this lecture that he had delivered in France in 1975. So now I've made this shift to the 20th century. And there again, Foucault makes this, all of you are familiar with, I presume, Foucault's panopticon and police, and the three P's that he keeps using. So here he's talking about the plague police panopticon, if we may put it that way. So he says there are two dreams. One is the literary dream, and one is the political dream. So what is the literary dream? There is a literature of plague. Foucault talks about it in his lecture. That it is a literature of the decomposition of individuality. It's a kind of orgiastic dream in which the plague is the moment when individuals come apart and when law is forgotten. So the literary dream is the dream where people bond, because there is a what I was talking to you earlier, this fear of mortality, fear of death. So when you know that death is staring you in the eye, do you still want to do an us and them, or do you want to bond? So a literary dream would be where people talk about oneness, because suddenly the humankind is made aware of its mortality. The political dream, however, is an absolute contrast. The political dream becomes that of a police state. Now, you will see this happening in many countries where the governments are slowly clamping down by bringing in all manners of laws, and by bringing in all manners of insidious laws by which they can they can contain their people and slowly and steadily make the countries into police states. The reason is very obvious, and people, because of their fear, because there's this larger fear of the pandemic, people allow themselves to, be dominated by the bigger governmental power, because somewhere the government is promising you security. But in this promise of security, what is the government doing? It is slowly and steadily, chipping away at what you understood as individual freedoms. And I can give countless examples of how this is being done in country after country, and it's being done with great insidiousness by governments, which are slowly and steadily, they are the tentacles of the police state is being pinned on the people. But people, because of the fear of the pandemic, because there's the larger fear of a pandemic which is raging, which is killing, people are happy to give away their individual powers. and the government is merrily sort of using the pandemic as a ruse to divide. And Foucault talked about it as early as 1975. And we see that happening. Okay, so how does he describe this political dream? He calls it the marvelous moment when political power is exercised to the full. Plague is the moment when spatial partitioning and subdivision of a population is taken to its extreme point, when dangerous communications, disorderly communities, and forbidden contacts can no longer appear. The moment of the plague is one of exhaustive sectioning of the population by political power, the capillary ramifications of which constantly reach the gain of individuals themselves, their time, habitat, localization, and bodies. So the governments are conscious of the fact that this is a time when people cannot come out and protest. People cannot, come together and protest, which is a part of every democracy. People can, at this point of time, because of the fear of pandemic, be divided in a certain manner. And therefore, it is a very, it's fertile ground for converting a democracy into a police state, which invariably benefits all governments. And I don't think I need to give you examples. If you look at what is happening around you today, I think the examples are glaring. Even today, there's a huge protest happening. There's a farmer protest happening. We are seeing the way our government is dealing with that protest. And of course, there are countless examples in the world, which I'm sure each one of you can think of, and how the pandemic is used very, very insidiously, as Foucault sensitizes us to it. And I quote Foucault, "A whole literary fiction of the festival grew up around the plague. Suspended laws, lifted prohibitions, the frenzy of passing time, bodies mingling together without respect. But there was also the political dream of the plague, which is exactly its reverse. Not the collective festival, but strict divisions, not laws transgressed, but the penetration of regulation into even the smallest detail of everyday life." So while the literary dream was to have the bodies together and suspended laws and creation of something beautiful, because when the end is near, you can dream big. The political situation was the absolute opposite, where this was used as a means to establishing a police state. And the stakeholders who might have otherwise protested, because they feel that we need the government to protect us. We are scared. We need the we need the vaccine. We need because there is so much fear all around. So one is comfortable giving up one's rights without realizing that it's slowly chipping away at your individual rights, so to say. I wanted to show you this incredible picture. This is 1562 by this very famous painter Bruegel, and just see. I'll enlarge it a bit if it helps you see it. Look at the kind of deaths. So it's like everybody just died in the places where they were, and everybody in this picture is dead. And what a ghastly death we are looking at in such a beautiful countryside. So it sort of unnerves you just looking at the triumph of death, as this painting is called. Just a sec, my cursor is not here. Okay. Now, another writer who somehow I feel never quite got her due, because she was, I think, before her times, So Mary Shelley and her incredible book called The Last Man, and that came in 1826. So The Last Man is an apocalyptic dystopian science fiction novel. So it's one of the earliest dystopic novels that one can think of, and this was published, like I said, in 1826. And what does this book do? It describes a future Earth at the time of the late 21st century, which is ravaged by an unknown pandemic which quickly sweeps across the world. And it also includes a discussion of the English culture as a republic, with Mary Shelley sitting in meetings of the House of Commons to gain an insight into the governmental political system of the Romantic era. So it kind of, it's one of those sci-fi novels, and it tells us that, what is going to happen to the Earth in the 21st century, and it's kind of eerie because that's precisely what seems to have happened. And Mary Shelley tells us of both the things, what the plague does, the pandemic, how it rages, and the politics as it plays out during the pandemic. So she actually sat in the House of Commons to get a sense of how a plague can be politicized. So The Last Man is probably the first piece of a dystopic novel to ever have been published. And yet, like I keep saying, probably this one author never got her due. It's not classified as a dystopic novel, as it excludes the political themes of repression and totalitarianism. So one of the things that we invariably sort of associate with dystopia is repression and totalitarianism, which we are all familiar with Orwell's 1984, and currently we are seeing so many Orwellian examples in the way the governments are running, and of course Huxley's A Brave New World. We don't talk about The Last Man, but do read this book, and you'll get a sense of Mary Shelley's innate understanding of a certain kind of futuristic science, the fear of it, what the humankind is going through, and the political repression. So she brings it all out in this very beautifully penned novel, The Last Man. Now I sort of shift a little and go to another author whose short stories I'm sure all of you are very familiar with. It's called The Masque of Red Death, and this is by Edgar Allan Poe, and this is published in 1842. This is exactly what we were talking about in terms of that the plague does not exactly, sort of the plague doesn't come any easy on the rich man. The plague does not see whether you're rich or poor. It does not see your station in life. It affects everyone. Now, this story is very interesting. There's a dangerous plague called the Red Death, and Prince Prospero is trying to run away from this Red Death. And Red Death is hiding somewhere in his so Prince Prospero tries to hide in his abbey, and in order to try and escape Red Death. So what does he do? Along with other wealthy nobles, he hosts a masquerade ball in the 7 rooms of his abbey, and each room is decorated in a different color. And in the midst of their revelry, a mysterious figure, which is disguised as a Red Death victim, enters and makes his way through the rooms. And Prospero dies after confronting the stranger, whose costume proves to contain nothing tangible inside it, and all the guests die. So, the disease could, at this point of time, have been tuberculosis or consumption, as it was known then. And Edgar Allan Poe's wife, Virginia, was suffering from tuberculosis at the time when the story was written. And Poe's mother, Eliza, brother William, and his foster mother Frances, they had all died of the tuberculosis. So he had lost so many of his family members, and even his wife was suffering of it. And that is the point of time when he writes this particular short story. And it could have been either tuberculosis or the cholera, because Poe also witnessed an epidemic of the cholera in Maryland in 1831. So it could have been either of the two things which prompts him to write The Mask of the Red Death, and it's in the realm of the horror. Everybody knows the end. Everybody knows that hiding from death is not really going to save you, and if you are wearing a mask to hide, doesn't mean that the death won't be able to see you. So the Red Death comes upon them, kills each person, and finally kills Prince Prospero, who was trying to run away from death. And then there is this picture which I want you to see. So this is Red Death, which is standing, which is looking quite horrifying in that strange sort of robe that it's wearing, with blood dripping down from its body, and the prince is lying prostrate on the ground, defeated and dead. And if you notice, there is this clock. So this desperate urge to remain alive, and then finally, at the stroke of midnight, he's killed. So the whole thing is kind of it's in the realm of the grotesque. It's in the realm of the grotesque, as one can see in this picture. Now I thought, let me talk a little closer home, and a poet which I know Bangladesh loves, and so does Kolkata, so does India. And I'm sure this particular poem, Puraton Britto, all of you all are familiar with. And I will, since I'm doing this in English, will read the English translation, though it's not the best translation. And all of you can, of course, read it in the original. So if you remember the story of Puraton Britto, which means old servant. So this servant was kind of, he was bad to look at, and he was hated, and everybody wanted to get rid of him. There was no reason for keeping this servant on in the house at all. And at this point of time, the servant goes for this, the master, he accompanies his master, and the master falls unwell, and the master recovers, but the Puraton Britto, or the old servant, he passes away. So I'll read the translation. Goblinesque of appearance, he was a fool beyond measure. Anything went missing, screamed the mistress, Keshto stole our treasure. From dawn till dusk, I swear on his father's name, barely any heed he paid. The caning exceeded his earning, yet witless was he, such stuff he made. Before long, and this is towards the close, regaining my health, as I was up and about, the fever set upon him. My life-giver appropriated my fatal disease, as each day his prospects grew dim. Losing consciousness, he lay there for a day or two, until no pulse in him was left. For so long had I tried my all to be rid of him, at long last of him was I bereft. So this hated man, his caning exceeded his earning. Every time something went missing, the mistress would say, Keshto has stolen it. And finally, Keshto, whom everybody wanted to be rid of, Keshto passes away by taking upon him he nurses his master back to health, and in the process, he loses his life. Another poet, very well known in India, he's Suryakrant Tripathi Nirala, Hindi poet. Nirala wrote his memoir, which is translated into English as A Life Misspent. And he writes that I traveled to the riverbank in Dalamau and waited. The Ganga was swollen with dead bodies. At my in-laws' house, I learned that my wife had passed away. So Nirala lost many of his members. There wasn't enough wood to cremate them. This was the strangest time in my life, he recalled later. And I quote, "My family disappeared in the blink of an eye. All our sharecroppers and laborers died. The 4 who worked for my cousin as well as the 2 who worked for me. My cousin's eldest son was just 15 years old, my young daughter just a year old. In whichever direction I turned, I saw darkness." These deaths were not just a coincidence of personal tragedies visited upon the poet. They were connected to the Spanish influenza. These were lines that were written in 1918. The Spanish influenza, or the Kalajor, as it was called at that point of time. So I was saying maybe some of your great-grandparents would be talking about Kalajor and how it affected people and how they would contract that fever and die almost instantaneously. So it was horror beyond what one could have even conceived. And Nirala was absolutely devastated. His wife died and the young child died, who was barely a year old, and half his family perished from the Spanish influenza. And he's written at length about it in his memoir called A Life Misspent. And now I come to our absolutely favorite poet, at least mine, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Everyone is familiar with it. Now, again, in The Wasteland, he's talking about, among other things, it's apart from what we know the wasteland to be, there is no, how do I say it? So it's a moral waste. People have lost their humanity. People have lost their morality. The Christian values have disappeared, so on and so forth. But also the kind of death and destructions that were happening, and he talks about it in The Wasteland. So I want to quote a bit from here, lines which everyone is familiar with. "April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Summer surprised us. Coming over the Starnberg Sea with a shower of rain, we stopped at the colonnade and went on in the sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour." So the reason why I talk about Eliot, and I'll talk a little about Yeats, is because though they don't directly talk about the plague and the destruction and death, but they talk about the wasteland that the world has become, that people, the moral wasteland that is sort of synonymous with the ailment and the disease that are sort of parallelly affecting the humankind. So in 1918, humanity was just staggering out of the horrors of World War when she was hit by the Spanish flu, which we've already talked about. And by 1920, 500 million people had been infected and 50 million had already died. And more US soldiers perished from the flu than they were killed in the war. And the reason why I talk about The Wasteland here is, why is it so fragmentary, so puzzling, and so maddening? Because life in 1920 was fragmentary, puzzling, and maddening. The war had solved nothing, as we all know. Wars are solutions to nothing. They just bring about horrors. And the horror of modern warfare and the devastation of the Spanish flu left humanity punch drunk and reeling. And the poem reads like a madman in a ruined museum trying to make sense of the artifacts. And I compare it to the pandemic of 2020, which has given us a similar dose of reality. We had not emerged from a hellish world war. Instead, we were living in a Disneyland bubble of affluence and technological marvels. I mean, we thought that, scientifically we had arrived, and, there was this bubble of, we thought we were all Teflon coated and nothing could happen to us. Then, suddenly there was this pandemic, and it was as if all hell broke loose. Again, the reason why I read these lines, because they're so reminiscent of what we are dealing with in the contemporary times. So, and I show you something different from either your shadow at morning standing behind you or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. Under the brown fog of winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many. I have not thought death had undone so many. Very, very reminiscent of what we are going through in today's day and age. And I end now with one of my absolutely favorite poems, and I presume a lot of you might also appreciate Yeats's The Second Coming. Yeats also experienced the Spanish flu very, very closely. So in November 1918, at the height of the pandemic's deadly second wave, Yeats watched helplessly as his pregnant wife, George, struggled to fight off the virus at their rented house in Dublin. And outside, the pandemic was sweeping the city. The countryside where Yeats thought of taking George offered no escape because it was already overrun with funerals and bodies. Before it was over, the flu would infect about 600,000 and 800,000 people in Ireland and kill far more than were lost in the internal political violence that was also consuming the country. So, I'm constantly seeing that it's the inner and the outer. It is, everything comes together in a kind of this destruction that we seem to be witnessing. So the Greek miasma, what I was talking about. So the internal strife and the external disorders all culminate in this complete disaster. So Yeats saw this up close and personal. He lost his wife, and in fact, this description, when I read about the Yeats, what Yeats suffered, I was immediately reminded of something which a friend was tweeting. He had taken his father to one of the hospitals, and he was tweeting to say, tell people that till now the pandemic was happening to other people and we were just reading about it, but now that I'm in the hospital, I'm seeing patients come in droves, and the doctors completely unable to manage with so many patients, and so many are dying and are being taken out simultaneously. So it's a hopeless situation. And if you've been talking to people who have unfortunately, they've had to go to the hospitals or they've had to go to the crematoriums, they're going to tell you very, very sordid stories, because that's what seems to be happening. Those of us who are, who have the luxury of theorizing about it till today, one doesn't know what happens tomorrow. We are probably the lucky ones who are able to sit a little afar and see it. But if you are in the thick of things, terrifying things are happening out there. So Yeats seems to be talking about all of that, and of course, in his heightened imagination, he feels that the second coming that is happening is not going to be a Christian second coming, but that of this terrifying beast. So, what are the lessons that the pandemic teaches us? Criticism of being avaricious, being greedy. There's so much greed. There's so much that the humankind wants for itself all the time. And what does it come to? We have exploited all our natural resources. We've exploited everything and landed in the mess that we are currently in. Rushing to the city for more money. A sense of complete callousness towards one another. So the sense of humanity completely eroded. And now what has the fear of contracting the disease has brought out this incredible amount of selfishness. I mean, I'm shocked at how selfish we have become, because it's suddenly each one save yourself. And in that process, we have landed up othering so many people, and we don't seem to even look at it as a crime, and then so what our authors, our poets, our all the people who have walked before us, all the people who have told us about the pandemic, what are they eventually saying? They're making a plea for empathy, they're making a plea for humanitarian values, and of course a plea for respecting nature, which unfortunately has been falling on deaf ears. And I end by reading from Yeats. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are these words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight somewhere in the sands of desert. A shape with lion body and head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by rocking cradle, and what rough beast its hour come round at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. And I thought I'll end showing you this painting by William Blake, a kind of what Yeats writes about Yeats. So I'll leave you with these thoughts, and thank you for listening to me patiently.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such a wonderful lecture and talk session today. I have a bit of reflection. I would like to share something. You can consider it as a query as well. So, sure. May I?
Yeah, please.
So, ma'am, as you just have mentioned, it was really insightful, that plague and pandemic. So can I say that, I mean, it works as the Lacanian real stage, as we as a character or the characters in the fictions, we never target, or while making a schedule, we never imagined or constructed any plague. So even in films or literature, coming to this note, we have perceived that the pandemic perhaps work as nature's weapon or revolt, we could say. So eco-critically speaking, it decrowns that center margin role. And we as a human race, this center margin role that we have formed, it gets shattered, that we maintain usually in the non-pandemic times. So in the academia, my question is, do you think pandemic literature can be connected to such courses like eco-criticism and literature course, as we do not have directly a pandemic literature course in the undergraduate level in Bangladesh here? So can we do that?
Yes, absolutely. It does relate very, very strongly. And eco-criticism, obviously, gender, eco-criticism, I think all the wrongs that the society has lives with and perpetuates and is unabashedly perpetuating. So yes, eco-criticism definitely, since we don't do pandemic literature. In fact, in our university, we don't do pandemic literature at all. So yeah, eco-criticism definitely as part of it.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much. I would like to hear from our head of the department, Professor Golam Sarwar Chowdhury.
Already raised my finger, but I'd love comments from my students and other colleagues. But I'll just shortly comment, because Dr. Sen's presentation, her lecture was really interdisciplinary on the one hand, and on the other hand, it was very touching. To me, it was very touching because one of my favorite American philosophers, Richard Rorty, speaks about contingency and how humanity can survive during any time of contingency. However, we saw at this time that the outgoing, if that's the right word, President of the United States of America, he started quitting different international bodies like the WHO. Then he threatened firing Dr. Fauci. And you mentioned Foucault. It's so interesting that all over the world, right-wing politicians or right-wing governments, they found a kind of a pleasure in trying to get leverage out of this terrible, terrible human situation. Yeah, which I can relate in my lifetime. This is the second time I've gone through it. In 1971, during a historic war of liberation, when I was merely 15 years old, I've written newspaper articles on this, calling a series of articles that I called Trapped in My Own Homeland, when even there was no guarantee of surviving for a second. I mean, that I would survive the next second, there was no such guarantee. Because that was the atrocity was such, and the fear was such. You see, fear was, you could smell fear. Fear, you were surrounded by fear all around. But then we had this faith in the resilience of the Bengalis. We had faith in the world, that the world was supporting us. Remember, it was the end of the 1960s. It was a much more liberal world. It was a world where we got support from French intellectuals, from French people, from the Europeans, from the American people. George Harrison's famous song. Of course, the United States government didn't support us for some other reasons. And we had faith in Mrs. Gandhi, the then Prime Minister of India, the role that she played in garnering, in getting world support. She toured the whirlwind tour of the whole world that culminated in her signing a treaty with the Soviet Union before the war broke out and we became free. Those were different days where I think Richard Rorty relates more than in today's world. Well, Richard Rorty belongs to the secular group of philosophers. Richard Rorty he says that those who would appreciate me must not believe that anything exists beyond the grave. So Rorty's philosophy is from one extreme. And the other extreme is like, even in a country like Bangladesh, I'm sure India, in South Asia, and in the United States of America, many people are thinking that this is the wrath of God. I mean, people have done such harm to other human beings, or people have harmed nature so much so that something is taking revenge. Something is warning human beings to be more empathic. To be more, there has to be empathy, human empathy. We don't have any empathy now. We are alienated from each other. So, and I thought that your reference to Michel Foucault was marvelous. That Foucault's understanding of power, how power is like in his history of madness. He speaks elaborately why mad people were picked up from the streets of Paris and taken away. There was a reason behind it. See, and I guess during this kind of situations, we see the ugly hand of statecraft, particularly the right-wing politicians, what they can do. But I can go on speaking, that I don't want to do. I want my students to ask some questions. I must thank you for your wonderful presentation, very interdisciplinary, and may we look forward to a better world. It'll come to an end. I'll say it soon.
I think the last bit I lost out on, but thank you so much.
But so even after that, your list. Yeah, we have to invest. We have to invest in the public sector, and see, capitalism will take another turn after this pandemic. So thank you so much again.
Thank you, sir. Entirely my pleasure. I hope your students enjoyed it. I wasn't able to see them, but this is the new way of, when you speak to a screen, you don't know where your audience is. I hope
Yeah.
Father Patrick,
may I invite Father Patrick Daniel Gaffney, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, for a little feedback. Father, the floor is yours. Father, the floor is yours.
Father, you need to unmute yourself. Father,
unmute.
Father,
can you unmute for him?
he has to accept. I can request to unmute.
Okay.
Father, you might have signed in from 2 devices, and thereby I can see 2 Father Patrick Gaffney here. I mean, we all cannot see, only I can see that. So the sound would be an echo if you do not, if you have 2 personalities here, 2 existence, Father. Yeah. Okay. May I help you, Father, in any way? We can talk till then. So you can share, Sarwasa, you can share your experience, how you got introduced with our academic and speaker Nandini Sen, and we can hear a bit of that.
can we not?
Sarwasa, before Father Patrick joins, meanwhile, can we talk? Sarwasa, can you hear me?
We can ask our students or colleagues.
I have already. They're only liking and viewing, and they have commented, "Thank you, congratulations, and welcome," but no queries in the comment section.
Father
So
writes,
colleagues,
my unmute is not working for me, he says.
Okay, yes. Unmute
It's a
is
shame.
not working. It should work. Then we have to do this. Father, we can hear you now. Father, you can talk. It's unmuted.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Because
Can you hear me?
I have joined your other existence, and the previous
okay.
existence I had to cut off.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to say that was a real tour de force. You brought together any number of classic masterpieces about visions of the future. You know, one thing that is a theme in most of these pandemic literature, it's certainly in Camus and many others, they're always looking to blame it on someone. There has to be a cause. Someone is responsible, and often it's the poor, or it's the enemy, or it's women, or it's doctors, or it's priests. Someone has to be to blame. And of course, one of the great things the poets and authors remind us, that you work through the plot, is that the blame is really within ourselves. We discover we are weak and that the world is not under our control. And so we learn something profound and dangerous and threatening by meditating on a pandemic. And of course, we're looking at our mortality square in the face. And it's a terrible sight. We don't want to look at that. It's the second coming with our own face. Very, very frightening. So anyway, thank you very much for your wonderful lecture.
Thank you so much, Father.
Thank you so much, Father. May I request Sarwasa for a vote of thanks and concluding notes?
Well, I would have liked my colleagues and students to comment, but maybe they are.
Maybe it's a prayer time, because here it's the prayer time.
But then let me thank Dr. Nandini Sen again for taking the trouble of doing some good research, interesting interdisciplinary research, and keeping us spellbound throughout her lecture. she referred to texts, Daniel Defoe, to Camus, to Yeats, to T.S. Eliot, to Tagore. I mean, very relevant. And she also made these, like the connections between Foucault, Michel Foucault, that made it splendid. I thought that was a very powerful presentation. And thank you again. We'd like to keep in touch with you. We'll be having more, like maybe you can have panel discussions. We can arrange that during this time of pandemic. Hopefully the pandemic is on the wane now. We can see the brighter side of life. Always after a dark night, there's a sunrise. And maybe in a few weeks' time, we can see sunrise. And there'll be real reasons for us to collaborate between us institutionally, between colleagues, and of course, to taking our university ahead. So thank you so much. Thank you for attending.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye and good evening.
Goodbye.
We'll be in touch.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's entirely my pleasure.
Your
honor.
time off. Very, very busy person. Taken off now.
So thank you, ma'am. Hopefully, I would request our audience to wait for the next one, which would be in December with Dr. Fakhrul Alam. And we'll be back again with the 6th series that would be. Today was the 5th one. So have a great evening. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute honor and pleasure. Thank you, Father Gaffney. Thank you, Professor Chowdhury. Thank you, Ahmed Tehseen. Such marvelous hosts, and thank you to my audience. Though I could not see you, I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
We really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was our honor to have you.